Imagine being 10 years old and realizing that every single adult in your life has failed you. Your mother gave you away. The woman who was supposed to be your godmother treated you like a servant. And the one man you thought was your friend, the only person who ever made you feel special, turned out to be the most dangerous of them all. This is the story of Katie Beers. And if you've never heard her name before, I want you to pay close attention, because what happened to this little girl is one of the most disturbing, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring cases in modern American history. She was kidnapped. She was chained underground. She was held in a dungeon that had been secretly built specifically for her, by someone she trusted. And for 17 days, while police scrambled to find her, a 10-year-old girl sat alone in the dark, thinking, planning, and fighting with everything she had. But here's the thing about Katie Beers. She didn't just survive. She outsmarted her kidnapper. And that, more than anything else, is the reason she's alive today. Let's go back to the beginning. Katie Beers was born on December 30th, 1982, in Mastic Beach, a small, quiet hamlet on the south shore of Long Island, New York. On paper, it sounds like an ordinary American town. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, families going about their lives. But for Katie, that town would become the backdrop for a childhood filled with neglect, abuse, and loneliness that most of us can barely imagine. From the very start, Katie's life was shaped by abandonment. Her mother, Marilyn Beers, struggled severely with the responsibilities of parenthood. By all accounts, she was not equipped, emotionally or practically, to raise a child. As Katie grew older, it became increasingly clear that her mother's home was not a safe or stable environment, and eventually, Marilyn handed her daughter over to a woman named Linda Inghillery. Linda was Katie's godmother. And to anyone on the outside looking in, it might have seemed like an act of compassion, a family friend stepping up to care for a child whose mother couldn't cope. But the reality inside that household was something else entirely. Katie has spoken publicly about what life with Linda was like, and the word she uses most often is slave. She cooked. She cleaned. She did the laundry. She scrubbed the bathrooms. These weren't occasional chores, this was her entire existence. She wasn't going to school. She wasn't making friends. She wasn't doing the things that children are supposed to do. She was working, day in and day out, for a woman who didn't seem to see her as a child at all, but as a convenient pair of hands. And then there was Linda's husband, a man named Sal Inghillery. Katie has said that the abuse she suffered at Sal's hands began when she was just 2 years old. Sexual abuse that continued for years, hidden behind closed doors, in a house where the one adult who should have protected her either didn't know, didn't want to know, or simply didn't care. When Katie was 7 years old, she did something incredibly brave for her age. She told Linda the truth. She sat her godmother down and told her what Sal had been doing. And Linda's response, the response of a woman who was supposed to love and protect this child, was to call her a liar. To scream at her. To dismiss her completely and send her away. After that, Katie never tried again. She learned what too many abused children learn far too young, that speaking up doesn't always help. Sometimes, it makes things worse. So she kept her head down. She did her chores. She endured. And in the absence of any real friendship, any real warmth, any real love, she found it in the most unlikely and ultimately the most dangerous place imaginable. His name was John Esposito, though most of the local kids called him Big John. He was a large, heavy-set man who was well known around the neighborhood. He presented himself as a caring, community-minded individual, someone who participated in programs that connected adult mentors with children who needed guidance. He was friendly, approachable, and to the families in that area, he seemed completely harmless. To Katie, he was everything. In a childhood devoid of joy, John Esposito was the one bright spot. He took her places. He listened to her. He made her feel like she mattered. When she was with him, she wasn't a servant, she wasn't a burden, she wasn't a victim. She was just a kid having fun. And for a child who had so little of that, his attention felt like a lifeline. Katie has described him as someone she genuinely loved. A confidant. A friend. She trusted him completely. And that trust, that pure, innocent, desperate trust, is exactly what John Esposito was counting on. Because while Katie saw a kind-hearted friend, what she couldn't see were the dark calculations happening behind his eyes. Esposito had been planning something for years. Something methodical, patient, and deeply disturbing. He had been constructing something underneath his home, a hidden underground chamber, carefully soundproofed, carefully designed. A dungeon. And he had built it with one specific person in mind. Katie Beers. 2 days before her 10th birthday, Katie and John Esposito went to Spaceplex, her favorite place in all of Long Island. It was an entertainment center filled with arcade games, rides, motorcycles you could climb on, and the kind of buzzing, chaotic energy that kids absolutely love. For Katie, it was a rare treat. A birthday celebration with her best friend in the world. She had no idea it would be the last normal moment of her childhood for a very long time. What happened at Spaceplex that day is still somewhat pieced together from testimony and investigation, but the broad strokes are chilling. At some point, John Esposito got Katie away from the public areas of that center. He carried her. He brought her to a closet. And behind that closet, hidden from sight, was the entrance to a tunnel. Katie remembers crawling. The tunnel was narrow and dark, and she was forced forward until she reached a trap door. And when that door was opened, the full horror of what John Esposito had done, and what he had planned, became clear. Below her was a room. Small, underground, sealed off from the world. There was a dirty mattress on the floor and, most terrifyingly, a makeshift casket-like box surrounded by chains. The walls were thick and soundproofed. There was no natural light. No way out that she could see. Esposito looked at her and said, "This is your home now." Back on the surface, a carefully staged distraction was already in motion. A recorded phone call had been set up, a recording of Katie's voice, and it was played from a phone booth near Spaceplex, designed to make investigators think she had been snatched by a stranger and had managed to get to a phone. The call reached her godmother Linda, who immediately contacted the police. The content of that call was alarming. A girl's voice, frantic and terrified, describing a man with a knife, a kidnapping in progress. Linda notified authorities and a search of Spaceplex was launched almost immediately. They evacuated the facility. They searched every corner. They found nothing. No Katie. No evidence. Not so much as a footprint. And so began one of the most complicated missing child investigations Long Island had ever seen. The man placed in charge of the case was Dominic Varrone, head of the Long Island Police Kidnapping Division. Varrone was experienced, methodical, and he had a sharp instinct for the details that didn't quite add up. And from the very beginning of this case, there were plenty of those. The phone call, for one. It troubled him deeply. A 9-year-old child, in the middle of being kidnapped by a man with a knife, somehow breaks free long enough to get to a payphone and make a call, and the language she uses is unusually precise for a child her age. She uses the word kidnap. She describes the situation calmly enough to get a message across before the threat returns. It didn't sit right with Varrone. He had worked enough cases to know that real abductions rarely unfold so neatly. Statistically, he also knew that the vast majority of child kidnappings are carried out by someone the child knows. A family member, a close friend, someone already embedded in the child's life. That knowledge pointed him squarely at the circle of people surrounding Katie Beers, and what a circle it was. There was Marilyn, the biological mother, struggling and chaotic and clearly not coping. There was Linda, the godmother, who stood to lose a great deal now that sexual abuse charges had been filed against her husband Sal, charges made possible, in large part, by Katie's own testimony. Sal himself was a suspect, given his history of abuse and the criminal charges he was facing. And then there was the fourth name on the list. The one who seemed the least likely. The family friend. John Esposito. Police sent the audio recording of the phone call to the FBI for analysis, and what came back was startling. The FBI confirmed that the call was not made in real time. It was a recording. Someone had recorded Katie's voice and played it back from that payphone near Spaceplex, timed and staged to make it look like an abduction in progress. This changed everything. The call wasn't a cry for help. It was a cover story. Whoever took Katie had planned this. They had recorded her voice in advance, scripted the whole thing, and set it up to point investigators in the wrong direction. This wasn't an impulsive crime. This was premeditated, organized, and carried out by someone smart enough to think several steps ahead. That narrowed the field considerably. And it started pointing investigators more and more firmly toward Esposito. While detectives worked the case above ground, Katie was living through something that most adults would not have the strength to survive. The dungeon was small and suffocating. There was a mattress, a television, and a chain that Esposito had attached around her neck, securing her to the wall. The chain allowed limited movement, enough to use the small bathroom area in the space, but not enough to reach the exit. She was completely cut off from the outside world, buried beneath a man's home on a quiet Long Island street, invisible to everyone who was looking for her. But Katie was not passive. Even in those first terrifying hours, she was observing, thinking, and looking for any advantage she could find. She noticed that the casket-like box her captor had initially placed her in had a flaw. The door was not as secure as it looked. So she went to work on it. Quietly, persistently, she kicked at that door again and again, over a period of time, until it finally snapped open. It was a small victory, but it mattered. It told her something important. This place could be beaten. There were weaknesses. She just had to find them. The dungeon had a shelf, and on that shelf were a collection of items, including several keys. Not knowing what they were for, Katie grabbed one and hid it underneath the mattress. As it turned out, that key would prove to be exactly what she needed. It fit the padlock on the chain around her neck. In the quiet moments when Esposito was away, she was able to unlock herself and move freely around the space. She memorized the exact number of links in the chain so that she could reattach it in precisely the same way when she heard him coming back. She was 10 years old, and she was running a covert operation. The television was on continuously, and Katie used it obsessively. She watched the news coverage of her own disappearance. She saw her mother on television, crying, pleading for her return. She watched her godmother speak to reporters. She even watched Sal appear on screen, claiming to want her found, which made her furious, knowing what he had done to her over the years. But more than the emotions, she was gathering intelligence. When police announced publicly that they had determined the phone call was pre-recorded, she understood immediately what that meant. They were getting closer. They were figuring out that this wasn't a random stranger abduction. The net was closing around someone who knew her. Above ground, the walls were closing in on Esposito in ways he hadn't anticipated. After the initial search of the family members turned up nothing, no evidence at any of their homes, solid alibis all around, investigators turned their full attention to the last man who had seen Katie. The background check that came back on John Esposito was damning. Far from being the community hero he presented himself as, police discovered that he had been rejected from the very mentorship program he claimed to be part of. The reason? A background investigation had revealed that 15 years earlier, he had been involved in the abduction of a 7-year-old child. He had done this before. Or tried to. Police placed Esposito under constant surveillance. Officers followed him wherever he went. News cameras camped outside his home. Varrone himself went inside to interview him, watching his face carefully as the questions came. And what Varrone saw in that man's expression, the draining of color, the visible anxiety, told him everything he needed to know, even without a confession. Esposito, feeling cornered and desperate, turned to Katie with a request that reveals exactly what kind of person he truly was. He asked her to play dead. His plan was to photograph her appearing lifeless, then present the image to police to convince them she had died, so they would call off the search, stop watching him, and give him an escape route. Katie refused. She recognized immediately that if she played along, that photograph could become her actual death warrant. If he convinced police she was dead, there would be no rescue. He would have no reason to keep her alive. She said no, and she meant it, firmly, clearly, and without wavering. She also stopped eating any food he brought her that he could have tampered with, worried he might drug her to get the photograph he wanted. Instead, she went on the offensive. Katie began bombarding him with questions. What was going to happen when she needed to go to school? How was she supposed to grow up? She told him she wanted to get married someday, have children, have a real life, and she demanded to know how any of that was possible from inside a hole in the ground. Esposito would give her bizarre answers, telling her she could do all of those things with him. She rejected every response with the fierce logic of a child who knows exactly what she wants and what she deserves. But she was also reading him. She could see him cracking. He started talking about ending his life. He mentioned running away. And Katie understood that if either of those things happened, she would die in that dungeon either because he killed her first, or because no one would ever find her. She had to keep him engaged. She had to keep him present. And she had to keep making him feel the full weight of what he had done. So she told him she was sick. It was the final card she played. She wasn't dramatically ill, but she communicated distress, vulnerability, a sense that things were deteriorating. And combined with the relentless police presence outside his door, Varrone's interrogations, the media attention, and her own persistent questioning, it wore him down. After 17 days, John Esposito called his attorney and said, "I have something very important to tell you. I know where Katie is. She's behind the wall." When police arrived to retrieve Katie Beers, what they witnessed was unlike anything they had encountered before. Esposito walked them through the process of revealing the dungeon himself, and it was a process. Investigators watched in stunned disbelief as he went through more than 30 individual steps just to access the space. There was a bookshelf mounted on wheels that had to be pulled away from the wall. Beneath that was vinyl flooring that had to be peeled back. Beneath that was a concrete block weighing approximately 200 pounds. To move that block, Esposito had to retrieve specialized equipment from the garage, a block and tackle system, hooked into the ceiling, which he used to raise the slab. Only then was a shaft revealed, dropping approximately 7 feet underground, leading into a crawlspace, which opened into the chamber where Katie had been kept. This wasn't something thrown together in a panic. This had been constructed deliberately, over an extended period, by a man who knew exactly what he intended to use it for. Police later determined that the construction had been underway for years before the kidnapping took place. And Katie herself remembered something chilling. She had played in that space while it was being built. Esposito had allowed her into his home during the construction, and she had been down there, playing, with no idea that the room being built around her was being designed to hold her captive one day. When the door finally opened and light flooded in, Katie saw a man she didn't recognize standing at the entrance. He identified himself as a police officer. He told her she was safe now. What investigators found when they reached her was not what they had expected. Varrone and his team had prepared themselves for the worst. At that point in the investigation, they had begun to fear they were looking for a body, not a living child. 17 days underground, in captivity, being abused by her kidnapper, eating sparingly, barely sleeping. By any reasonable estimate, they expected to find a child in a dire state. Instead, they found a girl sitting calmly on a mattress, alert, composed, and, in Varrone's own words, looking like she'd just come back from a trip to the movies. She was present. She was bubbly. She was okay. In that moment, he said, they all knew she was going to be a survivor. John Esposito was convicted of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The charges against him were serious and the evidence, including his own confession and the elaborate dungeon he had constructed, was overwhelming. But the case didn't end with Esposito's conviction. One of the most significant outcomes of the entire investigation was what Varrone and his team uncovered about everything that had happened to Katie before the kidnapping. The abuse at the hands of Sal and Guillory. The years of neglect and exploitation. The complete failure of the adults in her life to protect her or even acknowledge what she was going through. Charges were filed against Sal and Guillory, and he was eventually imprisoned as well. Katie was removed from the care of everyone who had failed her and placed into foster care. And by her own account, that transition, as difficult as it might sound, was salvation. For the first time in her life, she had a real family. A mother and a father who actually wanted her. brothers and sisters. A home where she wasn't a servant, where she wasn't being hurt, where she was simply allowed to be a child. She describes it as absolutely fantastic, and when you consider what she had come from, it's hard to argue with that. There's one more person in this story who deserves recognition, and that's Dominic Varrone. For 17 days, finding Katie Beers was his entire world. He ate, slept, and breathed this case. He pushed past dead ends, followed gut instincts, and refused to accept that she might already be gone. When the evidence started pointing toward Esposito, he leaned into it even when there wasn't enough to make a formal move. He kept the pressure up. He stayed visible. He made Esposito feel the weight of the investigation every single day. After it was all over, Varrone wrote Katie a letter. He told her she was a remarkable young girl. He told her he was sorry they hadn't found her sooner. And he told her that not many adults could endure what she had gone through. He told her to be proud, and to stay strong. Katie has spoken about that letter and about Varrone with deep gratitude. She knows, as well as anyone, that his refusal to give up is part of why she is alive. The relationship between them has endured long past the end of the case, a connection forged in the most extraordinary of circumstances. So what happened to that little girl from Mastic Beach? The one who was abandoned, abused, enslaved, and then locked underground by the only person she thought she could trust? She survived. And then she did something even harder than surviving, she built a life. Katie Beers grew up to become an author. She wrote a book about her experiences, and it became a bestseller. She uses her platform to speak directly to other survivors, not with pity or doom, but with a message of genuine hope. She works with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, channeling everything she went through into advocacy for kids who are still in danger. She has a husband. She has 2 children of her own. She has parents who love her, the foster family that took her in and gave her what she never had. She has the life she dreamed about in that dungeon, when she fired questions at her captor about school and marriage and children and futures, and he tried to convince her those things could exist inside 4 underground walls. She was right and he was wrong. And she made sure of it. I've covered a lot of dark cases on this channel. A lot of stories where the circumstances are grim and the outcome is worse. But the case of Katie Beers is different, and I want to be clear about why. The darkness in this story is very real. A child who was let down by virtually every adult in her life from the moment she was born. A system that didn't catch what was happening in time. A predator who built a literal dungeon and planned a kidnapping for years. These are things that happened. They can't be softened. But there is something in Katie's story that goes beyond the horror. Something that I think is worth holding on to. At 10 years old, with no education, no safety net, no one coming to help her in the immediate term, this little girl did not fall apart. She looked at her situation, genuinely one of the worst situations a child can be in, and she started problem solving. She found the key. She counted the chain links. She watched the news for intelligence. She refused the photograph that would have cost her her life. She asked questions, made arguments, played sick, wore her captor down strategically over more than 2 weeks. That is not luck. That is something built inside a person. Some deep reserve of will and clarity that most of us hope we'll never need to access. And then, when it was all over, she didn't let it define her in the way it so easily could have. She didn't disappear. She didn't spend her life in the shadow of what happened to her. She stepped into the light, told her story, and turned her pain into purpose. The people who hurt her spent years trying to diminish her, her mother by walking away, her godmother by using her, her abuser by caging her. And every single one of them failed. Because the thing about people like Katie Beers is that they are not diminishable. Not by neglect, not by chains, not by dungeons. She said it best herself. What happened to her shaped her. But it doesn't define her. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you for staying with this story. It's not an easy one. But I think it's one of the most important ones I've covered, because it's ultimately about what a human being is capable of when everything is stripped away. Not all survivors look the same. Not all of them come out ready to write books and give speeches. Survival takes many forms and they're all valid. But for those of you who are going through something, who feel like the world has failed you, who feel trapped in a situation with no clear way out, I hope Katie's story gives you something to hold on to. You are more than what happened to you. If you found this video meaningful, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want to learn more about Katie's journey in her own words, I strongly encourage you to look up her book. She tells her story with courage, clarity, and a warmth that you really have to experience firsthand. Take care of yourselves. And I'll see you in the next one.